More reading. Okay, here we go. This is chapter 2, The Doors of Perception. There are things known and things unknown, and in between are the doors of perception. That was from Aldous Huxley. All organisms encounter a specific kind of environment from the moment they are born, and every one of them has to be able to perceive that environment, take in information about it, and process that information in order to survive. There are no organisms that can or do exist in complete isolation from their environment, and there never can be. Not even scientists. There is no way to stand here and look at the world over there, as if there were no connection between the two except an observing brain. Such dissociation is in fact pathological. Every organism is deeply interwoven into the ecological matrix from which it is expressed. And every organism possesses an interface, a place where the outside world and it touch, and that touching is continual. At that interface are located specific organs for the perception of the exterior world, for the perception of not me. This is true even of the tiniest of life forms, such as viruses, and of bulkier ones, such as neuroscientists. Viruses. I don't know why I'm adding extra syllable. Viruses have, just as we do in the skin that covers our body, an outer protein envelope. The surface of the viral protein envelope is studded with receptors, just as the surface of our envelope is. These are the unique sensory organs that the viruses use to gather information about their surroundings. They are the interface portals, the doors of perception, that allow the viruses to survive, that allow them, as well, to find the cells they are most suited to live within. As physician and viral researcher Frank Ryan comments, viruses have a kind of sensation that could be classed as intermediate between a rudimentary smell or touch. They have a way of detecting the chemical composition of cell surfaces. This gives a virus the most exquisite ability to sense the right cell surfaces. It recognizes them through a perception in three-dimensional surface chemistry. Every living organism has to have a means to perceive informational inflows in order to survive. Every living organism possesses mechanisms to do so. Once environmental inputs are perceived, all organisms possess specific capacities for processing those informational inputs. Every one of them can determine the nature of the incoming information, its potential impact on the individual organism's health, and can decide what to do in response. They have to be able to do this in order to survive. These truths are fundamental, yet their implications are nearly always overlooked. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that this overlooking has been intentional, for the implications directly counteract nearly everything we have been taught about ourselves and the world around us. Because all life forms, irrespective of their nature, must, to survive, have a sense of not me. They all have a sense of self. They are, in fact, self-aware. Because all life forms, irrespective of their nature, must, to survive, be able to analyze the nature of the not me that approaches them, and further must be able to determine its intent, and further be able to craft a response to that intent. All life forms are, by definition, intelligent. Because all life forms have to be able to determine the intent of the not me that approaches them, they also have to be able to determine meaning. In other words, all living organisms can not only process data, they can also engage in a search for meaning, an analysis that runs much deeper than linear cause and effect. Thus, three capacities, self-awareness, intelligence, and the search for meaning, that have erroneously been ascribed as belonging only to human beings, are in fact general conditions of every living organism. Thus, the essential nature of the conflict between reductionists and those of us who actively feel the living intelligence of the world around us. These three attributes of living organisms have an important place in this book, but to get to them, I need to play with something else first. Something obvious, but something that's commonly overlooked. And that something is specific to experiencing the metaphysical background of the world, and that is the doors of perception. The doors of perception are in fact the sensory portals through which we experience the world. In human beings, as in most animals, informational environmental inputs are processed through the sensory modalities all of us are familiar with. Sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, and feeling, which is similar to touch but different from emotion, i.e., how a place feels to you when you encounter it. This is, in fact, a primary and sixth sense that all human beings possess. We could not survive without it. We possess the capacity to perceive the world around us through the use of sensory capacities that have been developed over long evolutionary time. And these sensory capacities are deeply interwoven with the complexity that we know of as the world. They are a primary point of interface between me and not me. For the ecological sophistication that we call Earth to exist, those interfaces must, of necessity, be extremely sophisticated as well. The world is filled with sensory events that have to be processed. All living organisms are immersed in those events continually. And every single one of those sensory events are filled with meanings, some relevant, some not. We, and every other self-organized life form that exists, not only possess specific receptors on our body surfaces that allow us to process those inputs, but our central nervous system possesses specific neural networks whose job it is to work with or process those sensory inflows as they move deeper inside us. All sensory inflows in every organism that exists are analyzed below the level of conscious awareness as to their nature and the meanings embedded with them. The function of the sensory-specific neural networks within us is to make sense of and regulate the inflow of the extremely large sensory data stream that touches us, and the amount of data within such sensory inflows is massive, though commonly we don't notice that is. If you look around the room now that you are in, and allow yourself to take in everything in your visual field, you can see just how much visual data there is. There is an incredibly rich range of shapes and functions and relationships of objects to each other, and shadows and light reflections off surfaces, and subtleties of color and textures. In fact, millions of bits of visual sensory inputs in just this one place alone. But until you began to intentionally look around you, you probably had little conscious awareness of the amount of data in your visual field. Specific parts of your neural network were acting to reduce the amount of incoming data reaching your conscious awareness. Most of your conscious attention was on reading this book, or listening to it, not on the visual field in which you sat immersed as you were reading, listening to it. And even though these words are moving through you, through a visual medium, or an auditory one, the printed words on this page, or the words I'm speaking, as you became immersed in this book, you no longer saw the words as visual input. You never saw them as visual to begin with. Sorry, this is dumb commentary. You left that surface orientation behind. You began then to work with and experience the meanings that these words are only the containers for. Once you did, you saw not words on a page, but pictures of the things I am speaking of, and, too, in your experience came the sound of my voice and the feelings that accompany the meanings that these words have inside them. You were, until I woke you from it, engaged in a form of dreaming, a special kind of dreaming, central to everything this book is about, and one that no one had to teach you how to do either. A rich sensory experience occurs during such dreaming, but what you were not doing to any great extent was paying attention to the complex visual field that surrounded you as you dreamed. You were at an unconscious level, restricting the amount of visual sensory information that flowed into your conscious mind. All organisms learn to do this after they are born, to restrict the background sensory inputs that are not relevant to the immediate tasks. And the more familiar your surroundings are, as are those in your house or on your regular route to work, the less such visual inputs tend to intrude on your awareness. It is possible, as you probably know, to drive to work or back home from a familiar place and not remember any details of the trip. During such drives, a part of you filters out the sensory inputs of the drive from your conscious awareness, but the unconscious parts of you do pay attention to all of the visual data coming in. They drive the car for you. They just don't bother your conscious mind with the details. And they would not unless something actually needed your conscious attention, like a garbage truck suddenly emerging from a side street. This phenomenon is common to all living organisms. They all have the mechanisms for taking in and processing sensory data, and they all have mechanisms for reducing the amount of sensory inflows. They possess what are called sensory gating channels, or, as William Blake and Aldous Huxley more comprehensively describe the phenomenon, we all have within us the doors of perception. Sensory gating channels can be thought of tiny apertures or gates or doors in specific sections of the nervous system's neural network. They are similar to the lens in our eyes, you see, that can expand or contract as needed to increase or decrease the amount of data allowed in. They act to prevent sensory overload. In other words, if we consciously perceived everything that was coming in simultaneously as it was happening, we would be overwhelmed with sensory experience. This is, in fact, what many schizophrenics and those on hallucinogens experience. And it happens for a specific reason that is definitely not pathological. It is crucial to our habitation of this planet, and this book is about, in part, learning to open sensory gating channels at will to whatever degree is desired, to open the doors of perception. If there were no sensory gating, every sound, every smell, every feeling, every visual input would emerge into awareness without any ability to shut it off. This is what William Blake, someone who can intentionally alter the degree of aperture of his sensory gating channels, was referring to when he said, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." And, as he quite rightly went on to say, "For man has closed himself up till he sees through narrow chinks of his cavern." Narrow chinks of his cavern. What a beautiful way to put it. The habitual narrowing of sensory gating channels that most of us experience. In essence, when sensory gating channels are narrow, as they commonly are, we only perceive a very small part of the world around us. Only a tiny bit of the radiance of the world can shine in through the narrow aperture that is left. The rest of it is gated out. Gated communities do, then, have some relation to the real world. It helps us focus on what we have determined through experience, schooling, and cultural habituation to be important. It also protects us from sensory overload, for it is true that if gating did not exist, if the nearly infinite amount of sensory expressions that exist in our world flowed in without restraint every minute of every day of our lives, we simply could not function. We would experience what many researchers refer to as cognitive fragmentation. We would drown in a sea of sensory inputs. As neuropharmacologist Franz Vollenweider observes, "A fundamental feature of information processing dysfunction in psychosis is the inability of these patients to screen out, inhibit, filter, or gate extraneous stimuli, and to attend selectively We need some sort of gating and some control over gating in order to function within the sea of sensory communications in which we are embedded. Hence, neural mechanisms for filtering sensory data inflows exist in the neural networks for every type of sensory input that we experience, including our non-kinesthetic feeling sense, what I have called heart perception in my previous book. Researchers in a number of disciplines have been working for over 3 decades to map and label the neural gating channels that control sensory input flows. They are doing this to learn how to pharmaceutically normalize schizophrenic conditions and to make a case for the continued illegality of drugs. Very bad ideas, for reasons I will get to eventually. I'm skipping quite a bit here. There's a lot of technical stuff. And I did tell the author when I was talking to him that I would skip some sections of the book just to encourage people that actually purchase it. I don't want to offer a whole book because I really, I want him to make a living. I'll read this part actually. Let me go back. If the unconscious parts determine that the sensory inputs have no importance, sensory gating narrows, and the sensory inputs remain outside our awareness. These deeper parts of us allows the sensory inputs to touch our consciousness only if they determine those inputs are important enough, though you, your conscious self, can override that decision, if you want to, that is. The pre-attentional parts of the self use a complicated analytic process to determine relevance. They weigh a large variety of factors to gauge relevance. This includes such things as the intensity of the sensory inflow, its novelty, the degree of contrast between a sensory stimulus and its sensory background, and its rarity. When it comes to novelty, the pre-attentional parts of the self look for patterns of similarity. That is, how similar is this new sensory input to ones that have gone before? They, in essence, engage in a comparative analysis to determine whether something is novel or not. But the new sensory input must be novel in a specific way, specifically because every new inflow of sensory data is not, in fact, identical to those that went before. No event is ever identical to any previous event. Each new sensory input does present the self with novelty. To override the continual novelty of the world, there is a certain novelty threshold that must be reached before a new sensory stimulus is considered to actually be novel. So while all the white daisies in the garden are slightly different from one another, you generally won't perceive any of them as novel, unless you decide to. But should you come upon a pink one in that sea of white, it will automatically capture your conscious attention. Then there is intensity. Sensory inflows of any sort that occur past a certain threshold or degree of intensity always reach conscious attention. A sudden loud sound in the kitchen, as opposed to the continual and familiar sounds of the refrigerator jogging in that room, will always capture conscious attention. This allows us, at the simplest, to determine safety levels in our environment. Hey, did you hear that? Shh. Listen, is someone at the door? Then there is a degree of contrast. When determining contrast, the pre-attentional parts analyze incoming sensory data against the background inputs. As an example, if you are at a party where many people are talking, not only is the sound gated, but the semantic meanings in the hum of conversation are also gated. Essentially, both sound and the meanings in the sounds are reduced in intensity so you don't get overwhelmed by the incoming sensory inputs. However, should you hear your name from across the crowded room, did you hear what happened between Michael and Jenny? The gating channel that is contrasting sound meanings in the room will open more widely and allow the sensory input through. It signals the cerebral cortex to pay attention. Once signaled, the cortex, in association with other parts of the brain, use stochastic processes to enhance the signal so that what is being said can be heard in detail. Well, he put the moves on her during a workshop. What happens in experience is that out of a sea of sound, your name just jumps out and is clearly heard, even if you were not consciously listening to that particular conversation. At that moment, you consciously begin to listen, and as you do, and as the pre-attentional parts of the brain open channels more widely, more and more of the conversation can be heard. Hearing your name in such a circumstance will always signal the unconscious self to open gating more widely, for any attention intentionally directed toward you by outside organisms will always potentially have something to do with your safety. That always overrides gating. In general, every sensory message, irrespective of its nature, flows through the same pre-attentional parts of the brain during the initial gating. Once this early gating occurs, the remaining sensory bits are routed to the thalamus, which then sends them to the specific portion of the brain that specializes in that particular sensory modality. The primary visual cortex for vision, the primary auditory cortex for sound, the primary somatosensory cortex for touch, and so on. After processing in those centers, they are sent to the cerebral cortex, which itself performs a final gating, and then they reach conscious awareness. During sleep, the thalamus, if we are blessed, acts to cut off nearly all sensory inputs so as not to alert the cerebral cortex and cause waking. Each of these specialized areas is capable of extremely detailed discrimination in very tiny modulations of the sensory inflows. The auditory cortex, as an example, processes the sound inputs that have not been already gated earlier in the stream. It specifically works with tone, pitch, harmony, loudness, and beat patterning or timing. In people that use auditory inputs as a primary or major area of sensory processing, musicians, for instance, there is much less gating of sound in the deeper levels of the brain than in non-musicians. In consequence, much more sound input reaches the auditory cortex. Because the auditory cortex is continually used to work with larger amounts of sound inflows with more subtlety, it becomes highly developed and shows tremendous plasticity, that is, continuous new neuronal development. This dynamic is what the poet William Stafford was describing, though he was talking about writing, when he wrote, "Just as the swimmer does not have a succession of handholds hidden in the water, but instead simply sweeps that yielding medium and finds it hurrying him along, so the writer passes his attention through what is at hand, and is propelled by a medium too thin and all-pervasive for the perceptions of non-believers who try to stay on the bank and fathom his accomplishment." In musicians, or those who, over a long time, attend closely to sound modulation, as good actors and writers also do, the entire auditory neural network becomes an active, intelligent sensing organ. Over time, unique invisibles, perceivable only because of the sensitivity and openness of the sensory gating in that neural network, are able to be heard and, as well, expressed through the activity of that part of the self. This is what Goethe was talking about when he said that every new object, clearly seen, opens up a new organ of perception in us. Children who begin working at an early age with music have, as habit, much less pre-attentional or unconscious gating in the neural network that attends to sound. Gating, in general, develops over time and with exposure, the pre-attentional self learning to gate whatever is not important to the conscious mind. Children, by nature, have much less gating than adults. Gating tends to narrow over time. If children begin working with sound early on, auditory gating remains much more open. It never narrows as it does in others, since the importance of sound perception remains high in those who begin young. The systems in the auditory neural stream allow more sound through to the conscious mind, simply as habit throughout their lifetime. In those who begin working with music at a later age, the simple decision to pay attention to sound and tiny modulations of sound will override established gating parameters and start the sensitization of auditory neurons, though it takes a while. As it is developed as a habit of daily behavior over a long time period, several years minimum, the neuronal fields become increasingly sensitive. Neuronal synchronization begins to occur. The neuronal fields extend, and more neurons form. The sensory zone, as it does in all musicians, increases in size. The pre-attentional parts of the self take the top-down decision by the conscious mind to attend to sound as an override. This resets unconscious gating parameters, and if you work at it long enough, the resets will be permanent. Gating activity outside of the normal bell-shaped curve for the population of the United States is generally considered to be pathological. The more widely open gating channels are, the more likely someone is to be defined as clinically abnormal and to be labeled one way or another as having stimulus filtering difficulties or gating deficits. There's some stuff about specific gating channels. It's actually very interesting, and I am tempted to read it, but I actually need to go do something else really quick. Okay, let's finish this. Soldiers with PTSD often have trouble with these two gating channels. They take in more sounds, are highly alert to any tiny new sound in their auditory surroundings, and rapidly cross-correlate new sounds with old ones, seeking out their potential danger. This will also keep adrenal stimulation high, putting them into a high alert status most of the time. Although studies on gating problems have occurred with various abnormal states, such as PTSD, migraines, bipolar disorder, Asperger's, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, ADHD, and autism, most of the work has occurred with those labeled schizophrenic. A common complaint among this group is of sensory inundation and inappropriate orienting to irrelevant stimuli. The bookmark was covering the word. And this includes a great deal more than just sound. It is often spread across the sensory spectrum. Essentially, they perceive a lot of things other people don't, and they don't know how to sort it out. In them, the doors of perception are more widely open than in the rest of the population, sometimes much more widely so. Inappropriate orienting to irrelevant stimuli, by the way, is a cultural definition, not a functional one. In other words, those with significantly open sensory gating channels are orienting themselves to sensory inputs that most other people do not notice, and attributing importance to the meanings in those sensory inputs that most other people do not. Further, they don't know how to interpret the sea of meanings they are experiencing. They tend to use the cultural metaphors and standards of normalcy that they have internalized to explain what is happening, the majority of which are inaccurate maps of the metaphysical background of the world. Those metaphors just don't work at helping orient the person in time, space, or meaning. Often, they make things worse. It's a software problem that extends itself as well to clinicians. Few of those that treat the condition actually have access to the metaphysical background of the world themselves, or even understand what access to that world means. In consequence, not only are the interpretations by schizophrenics of their meanings inflows crazy, so are the informational interventions by their caretakers. This behaviorally orients those with this kind of widely open sensory gating far outside the cultural norm. In cultures that recognize the importance of this capacity, this group of people are trained to use their enhanced perceptual capacities for the benefit of the group. There would then be many more holy people among us. Oh my god, can't read today. Okay. Schizophrenic states, in fact, share a large number of common features with the experiential states generated by hallucinogens, indicating that schizophrenia is not, in fact, an abnormal state, but is itself an altered state of consciousness. Part of the major problem attending schizophrenia is what it is defined to be, that is, abnormal, rather than an altered state of consciousness that has a specific ecological function for the species. In the West, such states are labeled as an illness and are almost always medicated. Most psychoactive drug use is prescribed for exactly the same reason. You must not extend perception further than the society wants it to go. There are very few people in the West, and virtually none who are clinically schooled, who understand how to train someone in the use of that enhanced perception. Once such gating dynamics are labeled abnormal, accepted to be neuropathological, there is generally no alternative in that system except pharmaceutical suppression. But when it comes to the whole concept of abnormal, a deeper look begins to reveal inherent problems. Studies have found that 1/4 of healthy individuals in every Western population commonly report sensory inundation, difficulty in stimulus filtering, stimulus over-inclusion, and problems with orienting to inappropriate stimuli. It is much more common among artists, writers, musicians, painters, and so on, those who use psychoactive drugs, and the gifted. It is also common among people who have been exposed to severe environmental stressors, such as war. Rather than abnormal, it is rather a common experience of the human species. Despite this, there are strong cultural reasons why more widely open gating channels are suppressed. You are not going out of this house with your hair like that, young man. Hey, wait, come back here. Nevertheless, the capacity for opening the doors of perception is built into us and every species of life on this planet for a reason. And that reason is central to the purpose of this book. As well, it's natural to us, for when we are born, our gating channels are very, very open. Thank you for listening.